Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you everyone for being here for this event. Thank you to the Melbourne Press Club for hosting this important event and for SANE Australia for organising it. We all know that mental health really matters and really makes a difference, and the language and the reporting and the images that we use about mental health is really important as well. And that's what tonight's webinar is all about. So I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I'm coming to you from. It's the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge any Indigenous guests who might be joining us at this webinar tonight. I also wanted to acknowledge that tonight we are going to be discussing mental health, mental illness and suicide, which can be triggering for some people watching. So if you do need any extra support, we do suggest that you contact Lifeline, which is 13 11 14. And if you are on social media, I was going to put Twitter, but I'm not sure that Twitter is still a thing anymore. So if you're on Instagram, make sure to, if you're posting about tonight, make sure to tag the Melbourne Press Club, tag SANE Australia. Their handle is, like you would expect, at SANE Australia. Mine is at Sophie Scott too, and you can tag Osher as well and Jay Lee. I'll introduce our panel, and if they can turn their cameras on one by one. We are going to have time for questions. As Kathy mentioned, just pop any questions in the Q&A box if you could, because we won't be monitoring the chat. We'll monitor the Q&A box for questions. I'd like to introduce Rachel Green. She's the CEO of the National Mental Health Support and Advocacy Organisation, SANE. And Rachel has expertise across mental health, the not-for-profit and government sectors, including helping establish the National Mental Health Commission. So welcome, Rachel. I'd like to introduce Osher Günsberg. He's a SANE Ambassador and a media personality with lived experience of mental illness. And as one of Australia's most recognised media personalities, he's been on our screens in living rooms for the last 20 years. And he's also the author of a best-selling memoir called Back After the Break. Welcome, Osher.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent microphone. And we also have Dr. Jay Lee Skian, OAM. She's the director of the organisation for the prevention of mental ill health called Every Mind. She's a registered psychologist, and she really sees her role about finding connections between research and practice and ensuring the knowledge translation in suicide prevention policy and practice. So welcome to Jay Lee as well. Just a reminder, don't use the chat function, use the Q&A function. And I'm going to be asking questions of the panel first, and then I'll throw it over to the audience and I'll be checking in the Q&A for any questions. So I wanted to start with Rachel, though. We're going to be talking about mental health and suicide, and one of the big focuses of SANE Australia in particular is stigma. And I really wanted you to just briefly unpack for the audience, Rachel, what is mental health stigma and why is addressing it just so important?
Thanks, Sophie. It's great to be here with you. And I'm also coming from Wurundjeri lands, so I pay my respects to elders past and present. It's a great question, and it's a funny word that I think sometimes we overuse in the mental health sector, but one you'll be hearing a lot more about from governments as they start to get ready to address it. Stigma is kind of a catch-all for the stereotypes and misconceptions and labels and actually discrimination and exclusion that's experienced by people with mental health issues. And, it can come in many forms, and those tend to have an impact on you that differs depending on what support you've got around you and where you are in life and in society, and even the kind of social capital you hold. So, for example, self-stigma or internalized stigma is where those perceptions and misconceptions around what it means to have a mental health issue might actually prevent you from getting help, because you don't want to be with those people that, you've been sort of conditioned to believe are somehow different or other. And it goes all the way through, stigma by association. You can imagine how that might affect families not wanting to talk at work about needing time off to support someone with a mental health issue because they're worried about how they'll be perceived, right through to some of the really damaging impacts of stigma where it becomes institutionalized or public structural stigma. And that's things like, the disproportionate weighting of investment on health and mental health. So, one of the facts and figures we like to quote fairly often is that poor mental health is about 13% of the total burden of disease in Australia, but only gets about 7% of the funding. And we've made a lot of gains in recent, decades on mental health, but they tend to favour more mild to moderate, high prevalence, but low severity mental health issues, which we see as being a form of structural stigma and discrimination that disproportionately, leaves people with more complex issues out in the cold. And I think it's really important to make sure that anytime there are conversations being had about stigma, that we always bring it back to what does that actually mean for people? What are the real effects on people? One of the things that our founder did really powerfully, Anne Devison, who was an ABC journalist, just like you, Sophie, she wrote this powerful book about the experience of supporting her son who developed schizophrenia. And just this year, Belvoir Theatre actually turned into a play, and there was this powerful moment where it began with her son, Jonathan, as a baby. And she said, we have these newborn babies. And right from the get-go in that show, people were thinking not about stereotype, man on the bus, schizophrenia, the image they have in their mind, but they were thinking about someone's precious baby. And that's what I always like to come back to and start with anytime we're talking about stigma and discrimination. Because when we think about people as people, I think the issue becomes much more real, and I think easier actually to get people to want to care about and address the issue, because everyone deserves, to have access to good healthcare and good support, and good social relationships around them. And in fact, those things actually aid recovery for people with mental health issues. SANE put together an incredible report that I really commend to anyone watching back in 2010 in response to a really important, in fact, the most recent data we have on complex mental illness is way back in 2007. And SANE put out this report with these facts that have stuck with me over the decades. And are still largely true. Nearly a quarter of people living with complex mental health issues reported feeling socially isolated and lonely, and 1 in 8 had no friends at all, and a similar proportion had never known anyone they could confide in. And I think it's talking about that kind of reality that helps people really understand what stigma and discrimination can do, and what the impact that has on people who are then left not only to fend for themselves, but then, their level of isolation and the impact of their illness is worsened by that exclusion from society. So stigma is a big term.
Yes. Sorry, Rachel. SANE's been, really at the forefront of confronting stigma when it comes to mental health. And before we move on to the other panellists, I just wanted to briefly let the audience know about Stigma Watch. They may have heard of it, but they may not know what Stigma Watch is that SANE runs. Can you just very briefly tell us what it is and what impact has that had on just making people aware of the impact of some reporting or some portrayal of mental illness in media?
Yeah, sure. Look, we're enormously proud of Stigma Watch. It's actually the 25th year anniversary of Stigma Watch. We deliver it in partnership with our friends at Everymind under the Mindframe program. And it's a program that provides an opportunity for the community to actually report media that's problematic, that makes them feel stigmatised. And then we work behind the scenes actually with journalists and support them to understand the guidelines and what they mean and how to apply them. And we actually have a reasonably good success rate in getting stories changed where those articles might be misrepresenting things or, exacerbating stigma and discrimination. And we also do some really cool work in calling out and recognising and giving awards where media's done a really great job of telling diverse and positive stories that help people actually sort of see the true diversity of what mental health actually means. So it's a program that's delivered by and for the community. We have about 5,500 stigma watchers. We get about 300 reports a year. And it's really, I think, an exciting example of addressing stigma in action. So, moving beyond just calling it out to doing something about it.
Well, it sounds great. And look, thank you for explaining that. And we will go when we get Jay Lee on to talk about we've got some links that we can put out for people to talk about some of the guidelines that you just mentioned in that answer. But I wanted to move on to Osher. And Osher, you've been very open about your own mental health challenges. Can you tell us how stigma has impacted your day-to-day life and also your recovery, your ongoing recovery?
Of course. And firstly, thanks for having me here. I'm grateful that so many people are interested in hearing about this kind of stuff. And what Rachel mentioned earlier about self-stigma, that's something I can absolutely align with. In none of my experiences in any of the jobs that I've ever had, have I been stigmatized because of what's going on with my head. It was all self-stigma. When I first presented to a psychiatrist when I moved to Sydney, my first year in television, I was really kind of losing it. And who knew that would be stressful? My doctor offered me antidepressants. And I didn't want them because I didn't want to be the kind of person that needed them.
Because of the stigma that you felt that if you took it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I didn't want them because I didn't want to be the person that needed them. And I really did. Now, it's happened a couple of times. By 2006, I was offered them again. Again, I didn't need them. By 2007, I'm nearly kicking in my doctor's door begging for them. All right? I wasted 8 years of my life when I could have been on meds, that I could have been doing some really great work and not, causing, turmoil to myself and the people around me. By managing, it wasn't an acceptance of the situation I was in. And it happened again. It happened in 2014. I got very, very sick, and I was experiencing, I got told you're experiencing psychosis, and I didn't want to believe it because I didn't want to have that. And I thought if I don't want it, so therefore I don't want, and I didn't, even though I really needed the drugs, I didn't want to be taking antipsychotics. Eventually it got, oh my gosh, so terrible. And I was in a lot of trouble, and I was in real great danger. So my doctor said, look, take these antipsychotics, but only take them when you need them. And then I performed the magic trick of the mentally ill as old as psychiatry itself. Like, if he tells me to take these drugs only when I need these drugs, if I don't take them, I don't need them. Yeah. I'm well. No, I was in a whole lot of trouble, and all it did was get even worse. Eventually, I ended up being on 2 kinds of antipsychotics, an SSRI and an SRI, and I actually started to stabilize. And finally, once I took my treatment seriously, I started to get better. It took a while, but I started to get better. But the thing that did stop me at every stage was I don't want to be the person that all these messages I had in my brain, the word psychotic was in my diagnosis. I didn't want that. I've heard all these messages about it. It's a terrible thing to have. I might be dangerous. Oh, no. None of that was true, but it was kind of ingrained in me. Now I've come to realize that none of it is true, but it did stop me from getting the help I needed and caused a lot of turmoil, as I said, for myself and people around me for way too long.
Do you think people recognise how much stigma is out there, whether it's the self-stigma or stigma that's in the community when it comes to particularly the more serious end of the spectrum when it comes to mental health?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not in the business of being a journalist, which I think would be very tricky, because unless you, even then, the ABC has to, justify their budget. You have to show that people want to read what you are writing or listen to what you're saying, and so you do have to look for an angle that people are going to click on the headline. And sometimes those angles aren't exactly the right thing of actually what is going on. There's certain news agencies in the country called it the Higgins trial. She wasn't on trial, but for a couple of days, that's what we read, because that was the angle that we were going for to get the clicks. And that completely misrepresents the facts. And I believe as a journalist, you'd want to be sure that you got the facts right.
And when we talk to Jay Lee, we'll delve into that a little bit deeper. But I'm interested, Osher, as someone you've obviously had a very long and successful career in the media, how well do you think mental ill health is portrayed in the media generally? And what do you think journalists can do to promote mental well-being, like the other side of the story?
Well, I suppose when it comes to reporting on mental ill health, I guess the first question you want to ask yourself, does this matter? I'm not a journalist, all right? I've got like grade 10 English journalism skills, all right? Even though I've done 50 billion interviews, if it doesn't involve itself in the story, does it even matter? I mean, think about kind of mid-2000s, it was perfectly acceptable for us to read in a newspaper about an Australian citizen who committed a crime, that they were of Middle Eastern appearance. That has nothing to do with the fact that it's a person who committed a crime. But all it does is then
stigmatise that person for their
not just their
background. Yeah,
every child going to school who matches that description is now a criminal. All right, we've since kind of got a little better around that, but unless a person's health is a part of what the story is, it doesn't belong there. And unless you absolutely know the facts of the matter, any speculation or any generalization about a diagnosis, that can have enormous harm, not only to people who are trying to get better, but to the parents, the partners, and the children of people who are, trying to get help. And, then it's the people who are trying to get help, like it would dissuade people from seeking help. Is it like when you talk about, reporting it well, I mean, say, for example, let's just say the next season of The Bachelor's, January 9, Paramount Plus and 10. Just say that comes out, right? And it goes really well, like really well. And you see what I've done on the show, which is different to previous seasons. You're not going to write Osher Günsberg, who lives with obsessive compulsive disorder, was treated for PTSD and experienced psychosis for a while, showed no sign of the medications he takes every day as he played the role of a well-suited Cupid. You wouldn't mention it. All those things are true. And I still take meds every day, but you wouldn't mention any of those things. You can't be what you can't see. And, if you don't see, if all you see is that people who are referred to as having mental ill health are criminal, then that's just simply not the facts. 96% of all violent crime in Australia is committed by people who have no mental illness diagnosis. All right. And I would urge you to think about if you're accurately representing that reality when you choose to run a story about the 4% of people who do have the diagnosis. All right. And if how often you're running those stories represents that 4%, because the idea that people who are mentally ill is violent is simply false.
Yeah, that data just really doesn't back that up, and certainly in the choice of stories that news outlets might choose to run, they need to be they do need to show that variety, so that the audience, the reader, the consumer, whatever, is not.
You mentioned the baby before, the play about Anne Devison. Like last night, I did a gig. I did a speaking. I talk about this on stage. I did a gig at this school, and I met a 12-year-old girl. All right, who's on antipsychotics. All right, she's starting high school. She's trying to do the best thing she can, and she's taking these drugs. Like, that's a kid. She has like every bus she gets on, that's how the people look at her when she's in public, if she chooses to disclose, is because of what you're writing. Right? So take some responsibility.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And understanding that the words that journalists use, the images they use, the headlines in particular, they have a massive impact on how people view things like mental illness and mental ill health. We might just move to, thanks, Osher, thank you for sharing that. And we'll move to Jay Lee. Some of the people in the audience will probably know about the mind frame guidelines. They probably have heard of them to do with reporting on suicide, but can you just briefly take us through the guidelines, how they work and why they're so important?
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks to Rachel and Osher who've come before me. Just to note that I'm joining you from Awabakal lands here in Newcastle. I think I'll start with the second part of the question first, and then I'll go to the first part of it. The reason that they're important is because so many people in our community are directly or indirectly affected by mental illness, suicide, alcohol and other drug issues, and any of the terms that they use to describe their own experience, because people may not use those terms that we commonly term. So this is really important for our community. So therefore, people want stories. They want to see the issues that affect their lives and they're grappling with represented in some way in the media. And so what we don't want is media not covering and not reporting on these issues. And we don't want...
That used to be the way with suicide, wasn't it, Jaylee? Like, we used to not report on suicide a long time ago because people thought, it might encourage, copycat suicides and things. So we want people to be telling these stories, don't we?
Yeah, and we do. And we want a sophisticated and quality kind of discussion on this. And I know that we've got one of the most sophisticated media in the world in terms of covering these issues because of the more than 2 decades kind of partnership we've had around how do we report on these issues. But I think it also means that we're ready for different types of stories. And so I guess what we want to ensure is that we reduce the chance of harm, because some ways of reporting on suicide, some ways of reporting on mental illness, particularly if it perpetuates stereotypes and myths or frames things in a very particular way, can actually do harm to people. But also there's an opportunity for good, because these are issues that people are grappling with in their life. And so I guess what the Mindframe guidelines really are a set of, I call them resources, people call them guidelines, tomato. But they're a set of guidelines, a whole range of supporting resources that really help journalists and people who are communicating publicly, including people like us, to make good choices about how it's covered, the language we use, the images we use, the details that we include, so, not including detail around method or location of suicide that we know has been associated with increased risk in communities following. Also trying to then ask journalists particular questions. So some of the things that, Osher had already mentioned, which is, one of the very first things I think in our guidelines around reporting on mental illness is it important to the story? And so often it can't be undone once it's associated. So there is no doubt that reporting on police incidents, crime, big things that happen that shake all of us. Sometimes what happens is hearsay or someone said something, we can get, or social media have made this connection between the person's got a history of mental illness. And often actually if you follow that story all the way through courts or others, it actually works out that either A, they didn't have a mental illness, or if they did, it wasn't a mental illness that had any association between what happened, but what the community remembers is that association. So
even if there's no truth to it whatsoever.
Absolutely. And so I think it's hard with breaking stories. It's hard with the 24/7 nature of journalism. It's hard with the kind of citizen journalists that are, playing in, similar spaces. But the opportunity to take pause and check, is it accurate? Is it relevant? And am I being fair and balanced? And so even if it is accurate, no one's telling journalists to lie and withhold information. Does it need to be in the headline? Does the image need to be the one that we've put with it? And so really, I guess, from my perspective, people might read guidelines to be prescriptive. What I say is they're a set of prompts that come from research evidence, come from lived experience evidence about some of the ways that we would like to see it more represented. But it's actually a conversation starter. So most of the work that I started on the Mindframe program back in 2002. So one of the first national programs that I ran, working with journalists, and obviously we had earlier work working with people that offer journalism education, so all the journalism educators across Australia who've been partnering with us for 25 years. But back then the media was quite different, but in the thousands of journalists that I've met over the last 20 years, there are hardly any, a very, very small number, that I think don't have some level of connection or care about this issue, because let's be honest, we know it's either us or it's people we care about in our lives. It isn't other, it is us. But actually having the tools to do it well, and particularly when you're on the run, when you need to file quickly, when you're trying to compete with another news item, when you're perhaps trying to respond to community pressure or community desire to have these things covered, there really needs to be a moment where we can provide tools and resources for journalists. So in summary, Sophie, we've got some guidelines and resources around reporting suicide. There's some around reporting mental illness. There's some on particular types of mental illnesses or particular issues. So on reporting eating disorders and body image, reporting on mental illness in the context of crime and court reporting, as well as some resources on reporting alcohol and other drugs, and some brand new guidelines and support resources on image selection, which is the thing that many journalists, and particularly digital media, were sort of asking us for some additional work on. So I guess the team try to ensure that what we provide to journalists and also our own sector as well are up to date in terms of evidence, contemporary in terms of the way in which we're covering and connecting with these issues in Australia, but actually speak to journalists and the kinds of decisions that they're trying to make.
And so I might just get you to tell the audience about the images and the image bank that exists as well, because I know, having written lots of stories on mental health for ABC, one of the things that we've struggled with is finding images when you're writing a story about mental health that aren't the classic head in the hands, looking sad, despondent person. And even my husband was putting together a presentation for me where I was talking about mental health. And when I saw the slides that he'd used for that section, he had the classic head in the hands looking sad thing. I'm like, you clearly didn't get the memo that there's this amazing image bank that anyone can use now to use images that are, not just those stereotypical images of mental health, which sort of suggest despondency and, loneliness, and also you don't really reflect what it's like when you meet someone who has a mental illness. They're not necessarily sitting on a bench by themselves with their head in their hands. So Jaylee, can you just tell the audience about this image? And also I just see in the Q&A, we'll definitely post the link to the mind frame guidelines we'll post it in the Q&A and in the chat. So, and we can also send it out to anyone who's registered as well. But just let the audience know about this image bank, because it's just so useful. It's fantastic.
Yeah, so for everyone who's listening, Mindframe is mindframe.org.au, or you can Google Mindframe and it should come up for you, and all of the available resources and links to, expert directories that you can tap into, lived experience kind of stories, and all of those are available on the Mindframe website. The newest edition is some guidelines around image use, because, Rachel can correct me if I'm wrong, but 25 years of Stigma Watch, often what we would find is actually when we looked at the stories that people were putting in as being stigmatizing, sometimes the words that people used were quite carefully crafted, but it was the headline and the image that went with the story that completely changed the narrative and completely changed the message that people might get. And so SANE Australia actually did some work on images a number of years ago, and what we've done is kind of picked up and enhanced that with some research, which is really looking at what journalists and professional communicators, what people with lived experience and what our communities think are recommendations around what types of images they'd like to use. So there's a set of guidelines, but there's also a royalty-free database of images that align with that guidelines that are available from the Mindframe website. But also I would say the other thing is that many of those image databases also sit inside media organisations. So if there's anyone online that, runs an image database or, has control of them within media organisations, then we're really happy to work with you on the re-tagging of images, because, again, when people are working at speed, what they often go is to particular databases, look for particular tags, and
you need it as quickly as possible. Exactly, Jaylee. Journalists are so time poor at the moment that having it in their own database will just make it so much easier to be able to say, let's use that image. We've already got it. We know it's okay. And just another question. We're going to be turning over to the audience questions in a minute. So if anyone wants to pop any questions in the Q&A, we've got a few already. But Jaylee, I just wanted to ask you, what should journalists do if they're concerned, if they need advice, if they want support, if they're concerned? What's the best way for them to? Is it to register for that image bank, or just to be on the Mindframe mailing list? What should they do?
Look, there's a whole range of things that you can do. Firstly, is you can log on any time of the day or night to the Mindframe website, which will have all of the tips, resources and links that you might need to be able to navigate this. Secondly, our team at Every Mind, so that runs the Mindframe program, and our partners at SANE Australia through their Stigma Watch program and their SANE Media Centre are available to journalists to provide real-time advice and support. So a lot of what our team does during the day is I'll walk past their offices and they're on the phone with someone, talking them through the kind of things that they might need to think about or manage in a slightly different way, or connecting them with some other agencies that might provide them with some context or your good quality kind of quotes. So again, the team can do that. Their contact details are on the website. There's also a range of training. So there are some scheduled kind of monthly online training sessions, but actually a lot of what we've done over the last 20 years is go into newsrooms, or come virtually now these days, post-COVID, during COVID, is to provide opportunities for people to ask questions and interact with the content. So there's a whole range of ways in which they can engage. But what I would say is please see the program and the people behind it, either at SANE Australia or in our team at Every Mind, which is Mindframe, is see them as a resource that can support you to get this right. And the other thing is that we've got a lot of agencies and people with lived experience across the country who are also being trained and supported over the last couple of decades to better work with media and be more available to media, so that we can get the kinds of stories that really matter to people. So we don't have the same voices with the same narrative, only covering the same types of issues. Getting to Rachel's point, I think we're ready for a bit more complexity.
Diversity. Okay, now we can, if anyone wants to pop any questions in the Q&A, we've got one from Alex, and she's asking, she said, journalists are taught to do this well when they're studying, when they're learning their craft at university, but sometimes when they get into a newsroom, a boss might not want to follow the guidelines. How can they help, if that's the case? So maybe go to Rachel. How can they impress on the bosses just the impact if they're not following these guidelines and they are putting out content that is potentially going to be stigmatizing?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. Look, I think this is one of the places where we can really help. We work with journalists, obviously, when a Stigma Watch report comes through, but we also do a lot of work in preparation for stories. And one of the things that we can do that I know has an impact is actually work with journalists to shape and hone the story that they're trying to cover and help with story development. So in the last year, for example, particularly around some of the awareness weeks or some of the biggest stories that have hit the media, we've worked behind the scenes with journalists who are trying to develop and craft something. And often that means we can give them access to people to talk to that they might not have been able to connect with on their own, and stories that are quite interesting and often untold. And I think that's, being able to at least provide support to journalists trying to do the right thing within their newsroom to actually, get support to build up a story that's just as compelling without being the clickbaity headline. I think also, we can and that's our experience. We have this direct relationship with journalists, and by and large, people want to do the right thing. And, when we contact them because a report's been made, they want to make the change if and when they can. And so another way that we help with that is by giving them the tools and the information on what the real impact is, why the change is needed, what effect it's having on someone, and what the flow-on effect is, so that they've got, they're armed with the things to go and say to their editor or to their bosses about why the change is needed. But I think, the more we can collaborate, there's a lot of great stories to be told, actually. And I think one of the challenges in Australia is we don't hear enough from people, from diverse parts of the community. We don't hear enough from regional Australia. And we know right now, for example, the APS is reporting 1 in 3 psychologists have their books closed. So right around Australia, you actually can't get mental health care for a lot of people. It's a big story and it's not being told. And so, media could also, through us and through others in the sector, work to tell more and different stories, and we're the conduit through which you can get access to not just that intelligence, but people who can speak about their own experience really, really powerfully.
Yeah, and I might just ask Osher, was it difficult for you, or what went through your mind when you decided to speak out about your own journey with mental health? Was it a difficult decision to make? No,
it wasn't actually, because I got told by a man you can't say no to, Alan Sparks, who's an extraordinary human being. I was working already with SANE. I was on the board at SANE, and I was sharing my story and in kind of what's it called, Chatham House rules kind of scenarios, when I was in boardrooms and stuff to some of our key stakeholders, and he just put his hand on my shoulder and says, "You have no business not being public about this. You'll save a lot of lives." I'm like, okay. And so
when you recognised the impact that it could have, was that a catalyst for you to think, "Yep, I'm going to do it"?
Well, I got my ego out of the way, and I remember, when I'm 12 and a half years sober, right? Remind me, I do want to talk about that in just a sec, speaking of ethics. And I remember that when I first got sober, it was a fairy story if you told me one day you'll be able to get through your day without alcohol or drugs and your life will be bigger than you can possibly imagine. I wouldn't have believed it. And that stopped me from seeking help and committing myself to a recovery program for way, 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 way too long. But I would sit in those meetings and I would hear people who were where I was and were now where I wanted to be. And it was like, Sophie, if I said, "I'll come over and meet the kids, but I'm going to blindfold you until you get to my house." And I'll take the blindfold off and I say, "All right, now describe to me the color of the cars on the street." You're like, "I know they're there. I came here in one. But there's just a chasm of, you just had to trust that there was a thing between here and there that I could be taught how to do." And so I say it all the time, you can't be what you can't see. I did not realize that life could, especially growing up in Australia, for goodness sake, that life could be amazing without drugs and alcohol. It can be. And so I just wanted to once I got my ego out of the way, I was able to go I just wanted to give to people what was given to me. And that was a story of it can be really horrible and really scary and damage, yourself and people around you. And if you be in acceptance and you commit to treatment, your life can be bigger than you could ever possibly imagine. And that's kind of why I'm just trying to give back to what, was given to me. And that's, any lived experience is like that. And when we're talking about, ethics of journalism, I have a podcast. I put 3 podcasts out a week, and I am very, very careful around how I speak about my fellowship of sober people, my super secret sober club, who count days and take steps. There's more than 11, less than 13. And there's a code of conduct around that. That has been in cohorts with the journalism community for 150, nearly 100 years, nearly 400 years. And I was gobsmacked when I had to call up the news desk at a particular publication and go, are you fucking nuts? You, like, on their headline, they wrote it. And I'm like, you don't understand what happens by doing that. By breaking someone's anonymity, you are putting at jeopardy a person who may not then seek help because, like, say, for example, I went out. Went out is sober person talked to. I started using again or drinking again.
Yeah.
It didn't work for him. It won't work for me. All right. That is just, I was just gobsmacked that I had to do that. And they were surprised.
So they hadn't really recognised what you're saying.
No,
the impact that by not, respecting someone's privacy and outing them like that they could actually not just derail that person's recovery, but many other people's recovery as well.
A great director of mine, Bernie Zelvis, used to tell me when we did the Channel V, when I was for Channel V before YouTube, there was music television, and we would do these live shows. All right, don't worry, I'm going somewhere with this. We'd do these live shows, and it was the same year that Jessica McKillop died at the Big Day Out at a Limp Bizkit concert. I was there. It was horrible, and we were all really scared about being on stage again. And after that, there was like 1,000 kids super excited to see us. And he came up to me and he said, "You've got the microphone. People just need permission to behave. If you tell them to dance, they'll dance. If you tell them to riot, they'll riot." And I'd seen that firsthand. And that power exists with every person that has a pen or a microphone that's on this webinar. People just need permission to behave. All right. So give them a permission to be great humans around this kind of thing.
And recognise that the impact that words and images have. Now, we're getting lots of good questions in. So I might just ask Jay Lee about this one. Someone asking, as a journalist, what advice would you have if, as journalists, we cover stories that are potentially triggering for ourselves or for colleagues? What advice would you have if for a journo who might be writing something and they're finding it triggering for themselves or it's going to be upsetting for one of their colleagues?
Look, I think this happens more often than gets spoken about. So, actually part of my PhD research was actually looking at level of agreement with the Mindframe guidelines, and actually as part of the research, we also asked journalists about their own lived experience. And what we actually found was that there were a high proportion of people who had their own lived experience of either mental illness or suicide, who were also reporting about these issues and also reported that had impacts on them. So I think anything that we report about and we delve ourselves into as human beings that touches our lives, that is about us, and particularly if we're reporting on it in ways that don't align with our own personal values or the things we hold to be dear, can really have an impact on people. And so I would say there's a couple of things, because the way in which we manage these issues are not just about what the individual can do, but what our organisations could and should be doing. So firstly, I'd say that if there are any kind of people in leadership positions in media, then we absolutely need to be ensuring that there is good quality, safety and care for all journalists and people reporting on all types of issues that can, increase distress, trauma and other responses. But also secondly, for journalists, is just to be mindful about looking out for themselves, but looking out for their colleagues and peers as well. And so if someone's been doing a lot of stories, and particularly for people that are really engaged and invested with people who are experiencing
really hardworking, they might be doing lots of stories, they might be doing a big investigation. Exactly, Jay Lee.
Yeah, so we've got some resources we've done with the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma that do great work in this space, but also noting that reporting on suicide and reporting on mental illness and reporting on alcohol and other drugs can actually be one of those issues for people. And so we really need to make sure that people practice self-care, but organisations actually take care of people as well.
And you make a good point, but organisations have actually a legal responsibility to provide a psychologically safe workplace. And so, if your organisation isn't providing, making sure that if you're covering, I know, for example, I'm a peer supporter at ABC, and we have a system where we're trained to look out for our colleagues and to look at people who might be, say, for example, if you're covering courts and you're, on a really big court case with a lot of distressing content, to just reach out to them and say, look, I'm just here if you want someone to talk to, or, if they need more support, then you can triage them to something else like the employee assistance program and that sort of thing. So making sure that you're looking out for your colleagues as well as looking out for yourself as well, because we're journalists are human too. Yeah, Osher. Yep.
But just like you don't have to let it get to the point where you're Michael Ware or Stan Grant, getting airlifted out to save the day. All right. If you're it's just look at your deal. Your job is to bring the really very difficult parts of our community to light. So we're asking you as journalists, can you go and report and get all the details about this really horrible thing so I can just kind of find out about it without having to get to the details? So your job is not only that, it's also to avoid getting PTSD. And you might want to think that I'm some sort of hard-hitting kind of, journalist and I'm immune to this kind of stuff. But put it in your day, like as far as like, that's right, I've got to defrag my hard drive and I've got to make sure that USB stick gets there. And now I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to make sure I check in with my friend and then I'm going to go and just put it in your day. Like if you've got to go and like say cover a really heavy case at the courts that involves kids or something like really intense like that, put an hour in your day at the other end of it. Like don't just think of, and now I'm going to dinner. No, put that debrief in there. You might not need it, but put it in there. Be responsible about it. Like, just take care of yourself. And like, you wouldn't go off and, play the grand final of the MCG without training or a warm down. So you're going to need both the lead up and the lead out to look after yourself, because it does accumulate.
It does accumulate, and it is cumulative and dose dependent. The more of that sort of distressing thing, if you're covering lots of distressing stories, it really can make a big impact. And you've got to have those protective factors in place, like you said, like, exercise and social support and relationships and things like that.
Schedule it in. Like, don't go, oh, no, I don't need it, because then you'll never do it. Schedule it in.
Exactly. Now, I just want to get to guest Jay Lee.
I'll keep it quite brief, Sophie, but the other thing I was just going to say is obviously not all media and not all journalists are the same. And so in particular, we've heard that rural media, where the degree of separation between community and the media organisation is very small, and particularly for our First Nations media, and I'm sure for culturally and linguistically diverse media that are part of communities they're reporting on, the impacts can often feel greater for people because they really do feel a sense of ownership for how stories are done. And so I would also just to flag and highlight for people that are embedded in communities really to be thinking about, how they get additional support for, being.
That's a really good point. We had a question about that from Shaz about they're asking about are there some mental health support channels specific to diverse journalists? And so, Rachel, what would you recommend? Are there any particular organisations? I think, is it Mental Health Fellowship Australia? I think there was one or two organisations that really do specialise more in diverse populations that you could recommend to Shaz?
In terms of cultural and linguistically diverse communities, so Mental Health Foundation Australia really do specialist work in that space. But I just echo what the other panelists have said. Seeking support is, best done, as the building up of a muscle through, regular commitment to it, so that it's there when you need it and you have the skills and tools. And, often that can be actually just, I guess building up a sort of a tolerance to talking about the impact of things and how you're traveling with that with your workplace around you. I mean, that's what some of the essentials of a psychologically safe workplace is. It's something that we really lean on heavily here at SANE. We're an organisation that delivers peer support to the community. And, another place that people could also access that kind of support is through our online forums, which are 24/7 and peer-to-peer moderator. That's about 30,000 members around Australia, and they're general community forums, but they are a place to also talk about what you're experiencing in an anonymous way and get support from other people who are also dealing with and reacting to a whole lot of different things. In fact, people are talking about the impact of stigma on, their access to treatment. They're talking about political issues of the day, and they're talking about, some of the really big things that happen and get reported and the impact on all of us, like COVID, like the fires, like climate change. So really seeing that as everyone's job to be part of the community and recharge your own mental health, I think is one way people could address that.
And we've got another good question that I might just stick with you, Rachel, for 1 second. They're asking, where can journalists find people with lived experience who are trained and sort of able to talk about their experiences in a safe way? Because, I know when we're doing stories, we really want to hear from the people that are impacted by whatever we're talking about. But obviously, we don't want to do anything to traumatise those people. So what would you recommend to the journalists and people watching who might be thinking, I really want to include more lived experience in my stories to get that across? What's the best approach for people? That's
such a great question, Sophie. So look, firstly, I'll say, SANE, a lot of organisations have speaker programs and lived experience communities. We're one of the oldest. We've been doing it since day dot. We've been around for almost 40 years, and we have a program called the Peer Ambassador program where our speakers, there's about 70 of them, and they're nationals all around Australia, a really diverse group, people who are executives and in the case of SANE, board members, people who are family members, carers, people with lived experience of all different kinds of complex mental health issues and trauma. And what's valuable about connecting with that group is that we've done the work with them to understand, how to tell their story safely and in a way that's, productive and helps highlight and illustrate the issues without creating further risk and stigma. And, we're an organisation that can also work, and we do often have families and individuals come to us sort of ad hoc when they want to tell their story, and we can help them make that connection and do it in a way that's safe. I would say to journalists, when you're thinking about that, one, try to resist the urge to sensationalize and think about, what are the underlying issues here, and be mindful that often when people have experienced a really traumatic event or are in extreme distress, they want to tell everyone because they want this terrible thing that's happened to never happen again. This is often the case when someone's lost someone to suicide, but there are very real risks in those people telling their stories in a way that's graphic, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about the issues. There are ways, though, to cover those issues that lean into the structural problems and the gaps in funding and the gaps available in services that don't raise the risk for the rest of the community. And those risks are well studied and well evidenced. So I guess, reaching out to our organisation or to others and helping us, allowing us to help facilitate that can be really powerful. But also think about which stories are being told. And I just want to come back to, some of the great stuff Osher said about, how he's, talked about his own lived experience and how powerful that's been. I think we also need to remember that there are ordinary stories that also need to be told. And I think in recent years, media has gotten better at talking about politicians taking a break and talking about, people who are well known where they've disclosed their lived experience multiple times over the years. But still, when it comes to someone who's a, blue collar worker or a retail worker and there's a story, the way that they talk about that person's lived experience and whether they include it or not sometimes has a different treatment. And at the same time, we're not necessarily hearing, in this example, I think of media much more broadly than news and print. It goes to television and film. We did a bit of a visioning session last year on what will it look like in 10 years when we've really achieved our goal to end stigma and discrimination and exclusion. And it'll be characters on Home and Away and Neighbours who, might live with something like schizophrenia or bipolar and get support. And it's just not the storyline. It's not the focus of the story. It's just they just happen to have that condition, but it's not, the storyline's not about that. And you can see what a difference that would make in people's perception of what it's like to live with that condition. If they were just a normal character going to the beach or going to, whatever they do on Home and Away. I think also,
beach.
Sophie.
I promise you there's beach. A lot of it.
I think also, when you want to tell a story and someone is very sort of newly impacted by something like suicide, you can get the lived experience perspective from people who are further removed from it, and that sometimes is a way of being able to tell the story and talk about the impacts without, potentially actually dramatically increasing someone's, very real and persistent trauma. So, I would encourage journalists, where you want to cover a story, to connect with us directly. We do a lot of that work behind the scenes, and we can provide support on how to approach it, what options are available, because we certainly want these issues covered. We need to be talking about where the gaps are in support for people and what the issues are for the community. It's just about doing it in a way that doesn't create harm for people.
Can I just add,
go, Osher.
For example, with talking about an athlete or someone who taking a break for mental health reasons, like, it's all in how you frame it. Like, you're not going to say Glenn Maxwell takes the summer off. No, like, he's broke his fibula, right? The man can't play cricket this summer. No one would have a problem, but he's doing it, so taking the whole summer off so he can be a better cricketer and play again. All right. Why would you report about this any differently? All right.
It's exactly the same. Just your mental. They're taking a break to recover their mental health and get their mental health back, just like a physical injury.
Jan, you would want a person who's at the top of the corporate, there's someone who's like achieved enormous things and like done amazing things for their shareholders or whatever. You'd want them to keep being the great person they are, because if you're a shareholder or you're a person who's invested, you want them to keep doing a good job so we all do great. So if you need to take a couple of months, mate, go take a couple of months. It's fine.
And I think, go, Rachel.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think also, Sophie, something we haven't really touched on, but one thing I think it's really important to be mindful of is when the really bad stuff happens, when a really bad thing happens, and it's in the news quickly, it's on social media, there's all sorts of reporting coming in, and then it's hitting the comments field on public media. As humans, we struggle to accept that humans sometimes do bad things on purpose. They sometimes commit horribly violent acts, and people look for a reason. They want to believe that there's some reason that person was other to them, that a human couldn't have done this terrible thing. And I guess we'd implore journalists to resist the urge to run with those ideas, because as Osher hinted at, we know that people living with complex mental health issues are far more likely to be a victim of crime. They're far more likely to have experienced assault and abuse, and 10 times more likely to have attempted suicide than the general population. But there's this, I think, quite human tendency when something's happened to want to look for a cause that is not, institutionalized violence, which is, a really important thing we should be talking about, right? And often that's what comes out as Jallie said earlier, when you follow these cases through, you actually find a history of violence and, toxic sort of attitudes and behaviours. So resisting the urge and being mindful of what's happening on your comment fields and how those are being moderated, and holding off on kind of proclamations of mental illness even having anything to do with it, because correlation is not causation, right? So even if a mental health issue is present, just because Osher lives with mental health issues, that's not why he has great hair. You can't just put two things
together. We know his hair's got an Instagram account, so
and create a whole narrative by virtue of into what people think.
We've only got 1 or 2 minutes left. So, Osher, did you have a last thing, and then I'll go to Jallie?
No, I was going to ask a question that takes a 10-minute discussion. But it's essentially like really, really quick. Kids in detention is in the news at the moment. Are you reporting on a crime a kid did, or are you reporting on a trauma response of a kid who's trying to escape violence? All right.
Yeah.
Like, it's important to kind of, if you want to really go into the details of things, like, are you reporting on a trauma response, or are you reporting on an actual, as Rachel said before? So there's a big difference, and that's way too much to talk about, but I think it's important we do.
It is important. It is important to sort of, it's sort of like not what's wrong with you, but it's like what happened to you to lead you to do this awful thing. So, Jallie?
I think there's a couple of things I'd say. Is context is important. The time people have is important. Learn about the kind of tips about, best practice reporting or things to think about before you need to apply them. So we've said before, one of the ways in which people can reduce their stress in reporting on these issues is actually have the tools at their hand. So find out in advance, connect our team to your organisation to do some bespoke support. But my final thing would be, we've got a sophisticated media, we've got a sophisticated community of people with lived experience. I think we're ready to ensure that we get different voices into the media and making sure that we're covering the stories that kind of shine light into places that haven't had enough light shone on them. And I think when I lean into some big kind of research studies that I've had the privilege of being involved in the last few years, people with lived experience are saying often their story is used as an anecdote to support a clinician's or an expert kind of view in the media, not as the expert in and of themselves. And we have some types of stories that are getting told and other types of stories that aren't. And so be brave about learning early about how you can really cover the issues that matter for our communities.
Okay, fantastic. Look, thank you, everyone. It's just almost 7 o'clock. So we'll put in the Q&A, we've put the links to Mindframe. We'll also send to everyone, if it's okay, we can send everyone the links to the image bank so that everyone can have that. And I really urge you to take advantage of these amazing resources. I think it's really important before we go to say Australia actually does really, really well compared to a lot of other countries in reporting on mental health and suicide. So to all the journalists watching, we are actually doing a really good job. And it's having guidelines like this and having this support of, SANE and Mindframe and people with lived experience like Osher, who are able to talk about what they've been through, that help inform our reporting and help us do a better job and reduce stigma. So thank you, everyone, for watching. And it's been amazing. And we really appreciate SANE Australia and also the Melbourne Press Club for putting on this really important event. So thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Jaylee. And thanks, Osher. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.